Hi, I'm John Howard, and thanks for taking the time to watch this video on acupuncture history in the United States. Today I'm going to give you just a little brief history about acupuncture in the U.S. I'm not going to talk about acupuncture dating back into the 1700s. That's for another time. I'm not holding out any information, but trust me, in the near future, you'll see some of the information that I've written about and issues of acupuncture today. So I'm just holding back on some of it. But what I like to talk about today is what I refer to as the Nixon years. Most people do know about the history of acupuncture and how Nixon helped usher in the second coming of acupuncture. But they really don't know the history of how it all happened. They know that there was a reporter and there was a surgery and Nixon was there at the right time at the right place. But the best and worst part of the story is that's really not correct. The best part about it is that there's some information that up until a few years ago I had no idea. And when I found it out, it blew me away. When you find out about the surgery and where it took place, it's gonna surprise you like it did me, at least I think. But let's just begin and let's talk about the history of acupuncture in the U.S., starting with what I refer to as the Nixon years. Like I said, most people know that Nixon helped usher in the coming of acupuncture in the United States, but I don't think it was Nixon's idea to do that. To introduce acupuncture to the citizens of the United States. I think his main goal was mostly, according to Richard Nixon himself, was to end what he referred to as angry isolation by the Chinese and kind of bring the Chinese 750 million people into the working force and into the global community. As you'll see, I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the highlights on the page. You can welcome to go back and stop the video and read everything. I'm just going to kind of give you a brief overview of the history here. So how did Nixon and the New York Times reporter James Rustin get into China? It was through ping pong diplomacy. They were both able to get in to China that way and actually open up China to the world and to the US. So that's really how he got in. Now, when Nixon was planning how he can get to China, he brought in his national security advisor, Dr. Henry Kissinger. And it was Kissinger and Nixon who were kind of going back and forth on who they would give the job to for this historic event. And we find through declassified secret memos and transcripts, there were 4 people who were really considered for the job. One was Nelson Rockefeller, George H.W. Bush, Mr. Richardson, who was the Secretary of Health and Welfare, and Ambassador Bruce. And as you can see here, what Richard Nixon really thought about some of these people. So take a look what he thought about Nelson Rockefeller. He kind of thought Nelson Rockefeller was a wild card, or as Kissinger said, he's not disciplined enough to kind of get the job done. That's a little bit better than he said about, the past president, George Bush. He called him not clever enough and too weak. So it was agreed upon at the end of it that Nixon chose Henry Kissinger to go on this historical trip. Now, at the time, Kissinger was Nixon's national security advisor. So before flying on the Peking, Kissinger stopped at Peking, before Peking, he stopped at Saigon, Bangkok, New Delhi, Pakistan. And that was really to throw the press off, but also to talk to world leaders. And by the time he got to Islamabad, Pakistan, the press was pretty much tired because Kissinger flew around the world in 12 days, as you'll see here in a moment. Before Nixon sent Kissinger off on his world tour, he said, let's have some code names for this trip. So the code name for him to go to open up China and to secure him a visit was called Operation Marco Polo. The president's code name was San Clemente because that's where the president would be the whole time, would be in San Clemente, California. Kissinger's code name was the principal, and Premier Chou En-lai was the host. If Nixon received the invite to come to China, Kissinger would send a cable back to the White House that said simply, Eureka. So those were the code names. Now, before this whole event even got started, it almost failed. On July 6th, just 3 days before Kissinger got to Peking, the White House got word that James Rustin was in the southern part of China working his way up to Peking. What Nixon did was he got a word to Kissinger, and Kissinger basically contacted his host, which is Premier Chairman Lai, and he put the stop on that. But it's interesting because you'll see that in the history, once Rustin found out that he was going to be delayed going to Peking, he demanded they put him on the plane right then and there to get him to Peking. Now, I know some people think that Kissinger took the reporter with him, or he followed Kissinger, but he was never invited. How reporter James Rustin found out that Kissinger was going to be there is a whole nother story. And according to my research, I can't find anything on how he found out that Kissinger was going to be there. It's kind of obvious he knew something. But then again, if you look at history, the White House, well, Nixon's White House, was full of holes, as you can see with Watergate, and specifically the State Department. So on July 9th, Kissinger arrived in Pakistan, where he had talks with the president of Pakistan, President Khan. And the next morning, they were going to leave to go to Peking. So they flew out of Islamabad really early in the morning on the president's plane. And before it even began, it almost ended again. This time, this mission was so secret, the Secret Service had no clue that there was a plane waiting for them with 4 Chinese delegates there that were going to meet the Americans. And one of them was a translator named Nancy Tang, who was actually a colleague or past friend of Kissinger. They knew each other. Nancy Tang was born in Brooklyn. I think her dad was the CEO of Chase Manhattan at one point back in the 30s, if I remember correctly. It's actually in here. I don't want to go through the whole thing, but you can read it. And Kissinger actually had to say, put your guns down. It's okay. It's okay. So they get off in the air, and it was interesting because they showed some common humanitarian that everybody, I guess you could say, they had some common flaws, if you will. One of the first things I saw was that no one in the American delegation smoked, but when they were giving out cigarettes to the Chinese pilots just jumped at them. They just dove on them, which was kind of interesting. But on the American side, Kissinger forgot his shirts. So he basically boarded the plane with no clothes except what he had on, and he had to borrow some of his clothes from his assistant. So the flight flew him over from Islamabad, Pakistan, over K2, the second highest mountain in the world. And I think Kissinger was pretty surprised because he thought China was just a barren desert wasteland, and he got to see a part of the world he really never saw before. So when he got to China and met with the premier, he was there for a total of 49 hours. And out of that 49 hours, he spoke with the premier for a total of 17 hours. On the way back to the United States, he stopped back in Pakistan en route to California, but he flew through Tehran, Iran, which I find kind of interesting because we wouldn't do that today. But anyway, as the plane took off from Pakistan, Kissinger sent a secure cable to the White House that simply read, Eureka. So 3 days later, on the 13th, Kissinger arrived in California to meet with the president, and that's where they were going to plan their national broadcast of this historic event. So on the 15th of July, 1971, Richard Nixon came on the television at 10:30 at night Eastern time and 7:30 at night Pacific time, which he was, and he made a statement. I don't know what the copyrights are, but on my video right here, I'll leave it up. If you click this, you'll see Nixon's actual speech, but he basically says the announcement that he'll be reading will be issued simultaneously in Peking and in the United States. And that's how the world found out that Richard Nixon was going to China. Now, enter James Ruxton. He's a very interesting fellow. If you know anything about politics or you follow politics, which I try not to do, especially these days, he was a kind of middle of the road guy. When that incident happened on Chappaquiddick with Ted Kennedy, he said, tragedy strikes the Kennedys again. And his editor at the New York Times basically said, what, are you crazy? An innocent woman by the name of Mary Jo Kopechne died, and you're worried about Ted Kennedy. So he was a Democrat and a Republican. He, like I said, he basically walked the middle of the road. But so through some more secret cables we have here, on the 19th, the White House had a meeting and how they were going to continue the planning of this trip to China. And as you can see, the president talks about how serious China is and about how they take their security really, really up front, and bar job with none, because security to them and secretality, being secret, was more important. Apologize for the double talking here. It's 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, kind of late, but I just wanted to get this out. And then you can see what Kissinger reported. He said basically Rustin's over there in China trying to ask anybody about anything, and he can't get anything out of anybody over there. So China kept a really, really tight-lipped. So Rustin, his plan was to get into China and to get there at the same time that Kissinger did. But as you can see, that he kind of got sidetracked a little bit, and especially when they put the kibosh on his getting the Peking at the same time as Kissinger. And this is just as a way of getting there. Whenever the White House actually had a problem with Rustin, they refer to him as Scotty in their classified documents or their conversations. They refer to him as Scotty. But what happened was, when he got there on the 15th, he felt a stab in pain right in his groin, and it was, of course, later diagnosed as appendicitis, and they took him to what is at the time was called the Peking Union Medical College Hospital. That's where he had his operation, and that was also called the Anti-Imperialist Hospital. So later on in his book, or actually in his article too, Rustin said that when he learned of Kissinger leaving, he said that was the straw that broke the camel's back, and he blames his appendicitis rupturing on Henry Kissinger. And he was in such delirium that he thought that Kissinger was up in the corner of a ceiling in a covered rickshaw smiling at him. So I guess Rustin was pretty still pissed off that he didn't get the scoop. So he goes for the surgery, and I think we all know the rest, because on July 26th, 1971, you'll see this article on the front page from the New York Times that says about my operation in Peking. What I want to show you here is, if you see the front page, take a look at, you'll see the Apollo 15 astronauts going to space on that day. I want you to show you that particular column, because we're going to reference one of the astronauts, Colonel David Smith, further down. And here you go, on the bottom right-hand side of the corner of the page, you'll see now about my operation in Peking. And that's where Rustin talks about his post-surgical acupuncture treatments that he had to help with the pain. Just making friends with the United States, the premier felt kind of bad, because he goes, that's all we need is this, esteemed colleague from the U.S., famous reporter, dying on our watch. We don't want to do that. So what the premier did is he went to the hospital and said, hey, look, if you get better, I'll grant you an interview. And about a month later, he got better, and that interview that he granted him actually lasted for 5 hours. It was actually at the sacred temple. Now, with the ushering of acupuncture into the United States, Richard Nixon's personal physician at the White House basically said this: I'm afraid that many doctors will attempt to use acupuncture for a therapeutic effect with limited or practically no knowledge, and a lot of damage will be done. He foreseen the future. I think you all know what I'm talking about. Very smart man. He was also Nelson Rockefeller's family personal physician too. I'm bringing up these names because they'll come back here in a moment. Here is Major General Dr. Walter Couch, pictured right in the right of Nixon. That's at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland. I used to work there in that same exact building, so I know it pretty well. This doctor, Walter Couch, he actually escorted Nixon to China. And when he got back from China, he was so impressed with acupuncture, he actually wrote an article called I Watched Acupuncture Work, and it was written up in the Reader's Digest, and he also wrote a foreword for a book in 1974. Now, the Major General is no quack. He was a highly decorated military officer, and he won some of the highest medals that the U.S. military awarded. And one of them was the Distinguishing Service Medal. Remember that. Remember that. Other people who won that medal were General Dwight E. Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur, Chuck Yeager, the first gentleman to break the speed barrier, Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon, and Colonel Dave Scott, who walked on the moon, also received the Distinguished Service Medal. So the doctor was in some good company. He wasn't just a quack. They don't offer these, and they don't give these medals out just willy-nilly. Trust me, I know. I was in the military. I didn't get anything close to that. None. That's the highest medal you can win before you perish, pretty much, or almost perish. You don't want the other three that are above that. Trust me, you don't. And God bless the ones who have it. Now, not right after Nixon came back from China in '72 did acupuncture start now appearing in the United States. You'll see in 1972 at Albert Einstein College of Medicine Hospital that they did the first acupuncture anesthesia on a surgery for hernia. Now here we are, all the President's Men, or the Peking Hospital. You'll see the Rockefeller Foundation, or the Rockefeller family here. And if you see Nelson D. Rockefeller to the left, he was one of the people that were considered for the job to go to Peking. Nixon chose not to use him. And the reason why he came up was because he was a rock star in China. Now, we all know the story about Rustin going and Nixon, but they forgot to tell you the best part. The reason why the Rockefeller was considered for the job, it was his family, the Rockefeller Foundation, who built the hospital where Rustin had the surgery. That's right. The Peking Union Medical College, the anti-imperialist medical hospital, was built by the Rockefeller Foundation. It was their second biggest project. It started in 1913. Most people don't know that. And to me, I was so blown away. Here we are building hospitals. Well, American citizens are building hospitals around the world that are being used for acupuncture, and we don't use it here. Well, we do, but like I said, I'll talk about that later. But most people don't know that the Rockefeller Foundation actually built this hospital. Here's it nearing its completion in 1921. And on a final note, well, almost a final note, here's the first Board of Trustees meeting with John D. Rockefeller in the middle. He's the guy who looks like Colonel Sanders. That's him right there. And the goal was to make this hospital so they can bring Western medicine, kind of like the medicine based on John Hopkins in Baltimore School of Medicine, to China and open it up. And again, on a final note, that same hospital in 1924 is where scientists were able to discover and isolate ephedrine from a Chinese herb called mahuang. So the United States had a really pretty big role in helping it launch its own second launch of acupuncture in the country. Again, like I said, acupuncture was used in the U.S. all the way back into the 1790s. Military used it as early as 1838. U.S. Navy, actually. We used moxa. 1826, a medical student at the University of Pennsylvania wrote a dissertation on acupuncture titled Acupuncturization and got his medical degree. And there was some more, plus also on dissertations on moxa. Like I said, I'll speak more about that. And even another surprise, that one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, a founding father, taught acupuncture and auriculotherapy in the 1700s. They didn't teach you that in school, did they? Well, look forward to that, and I promise you it will be coming in the near future. most likely at the Acupuncture Today column. Thank you.